Yes, hello. Hopefully I am live and this is working. It's Saturday afternoon. I've got about 20 minutes off between when the kids are having a nap. So I thought I would use this as an opportunity to talk about how to perform a Bayesian meta-analysis using R. Now, there are two reasons why you would want to consider using a Bayesian meta-analysis. And most meta-analyses are done using a frequentist framework. And one of the limitations of using a frequentist framework is that your decision is very binary based on an arbitrary measure of 0.05, or what is typically 0.05. And when it comes to using, and the second thing about using this is that it's very difficult to actually understand the size of your effect. So on top of having your binary decision, you don't understand the size of your effect. Quite often you pair your result with an effect size measure like Cohen's D or Hedges G. However, the size of these effects are different between research areas and fields. Of course, we have Cohen standards for what constitutes a medium, small, or a large effect. However, those were very specific and should only be used as a fallback, and this shouldn't be actually used between different research fields. Now, the second thing about using a frequentist approach or a conventional frequentist approach is that with that, when you get a non-significant result, this is not very informative. A non-significant result can either be due to the support of a null model or your data could be insensitive. There is no way for you to know what one of these two, what it is, whether it's due to an insensitive model or due to the support of a null, whether it's due to insensitive data or whether it's due to the support of a null model, no matter how big or small your p value is. So if you get a non-significant result, it's very difficult to actually understand what this finding means. Now, taking a Bayesian approach for your meta-analysis, firstly, it does away with this binary decision of whether it's significant or non-significant, because what you're looking at is the relative evidence between an alternative model, typically an alternative model, and a null model. And you can get a conclusion saying, well, we have 10 times more evidence or 100 times more evidence for an alternative model versus a null model, which is much more informative than using a p-value and associating that with a measure of effect size. And alternatively, when it comes to actually understanding null effects, with Bayes factors, what you can do is you can actually do this relative comparison also with a null model versus an alternative model. So you can actually say with confidence either the data is still insensitive because maybe you only have 1.5 times more evidence for a null model relative to an alternative model, which isn't very conclusive. Or you can actually say, hey, we have 10 times more evidence for a null model versus an alternative model. So let's jump in to our analysis. What we're first going to start doing is we're going to do a conventional frequentist meta-analysis. To do this, we're going to be using the Metaphor package, which is absolutely fantastic and has some of the best documentation for any R package that's out there. So we'll load our package here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to load one of the data files, which is built in to this R package. And this is a file, or this is a meta-analysis which looks at the relationship between the personality trait of conscientiousness and the likelihood that you're going to adhere to taking medications. For a lot of people, when they're actually prescribed a medication, they don't tend to take it or to follow the prescription. So for this particular research question, this was including a bunch of studies. I think it's 16 or 17 that was investigating the research question: is the personality trait of conscientiousness associated with medication adherence? So we're going to load this data set, and then what we're going to do is we are going to calculate our measures of effect size and their variances. When it comes to using Pearson's R, or a measure of correlation, these tend to be biased at the lower ends and the higher ends. So when we're doing meta-analysis, the best thing to do is to convert this into a Fisher's Z-score. So what we're doing with this ESCalc function here is we are converting our measures of our correlation measures, which is the RI and the number of participants in each study. And with those two pieces of information, we can calculate Fisher Z and the variance of Fisher Z. So we're going to run that, and what we've done here is this creates a new data set. Just have a look at the data set here, just to give you an idea of what it looks like. Here we go. So it's loading. This is our data set. So in our column here, we have authors, year, and we converted the number. That's the number of participants in each study, and the Pearson's R correlation. There's a number of other potential moderators, which we're not going to be looking at for this particular tutorial. And here are the two measures that we've calculated: YI, which is Fisher Z, or measure of effect size, and VI, which is a measure of variance. So now that we have those two things, we can perform our meta-analysis using the RoMA function. So we enter in YI first, which is our measure of effect size, VI, which is our measure of variance, and we also specify the data set that we're taking these measures from, which is our DAT data set. And we then create the res object. And let's have a look at the results of our conventional meta-analysis. This is using, by default, the RoMA function uses a random effects model. Of course, you can change that if you want to use a fixed effects model, and you can also change how heterogeneity was calculated. For this particular analysis, we used the REML heterogeneity estimator, and we can see here that there was significant heterogeneity. First, what we'll do is let's visualize this using the forest function, which takes what you have created in your res object, and we can create a forest plot, which is a very nice visualization. Let's zoom in so we can take a better look. And we have visualized our frequentist meta-analysis with all of our studies. We can see that there's a range of effects here, and it's not surprising that we have significant heterogeneity, because some of these effects, while looking at them, they were significant. Others were one of them was zero, so it was there was absolutely not much evidence there. And we have a range of effects. Most of them were positive, but some of them were on the negative side when it comes to the correlation. But overall, we have our random effects model and our summary effect size of 0.15. So we'll close this. Significant heterogeneity with these studies, and our estimate, our summary effect size estimate, rounding up, is 0.15, which was statistically significant. So it was less than 0.0001. And we'll also look at our funnel plot. What we're going to do is typically when it comes to looking at measures of publication bias, which a lot of people are interested in when they're doing a meta-analysis, people will run a Eggers regression test, which is a measure of funnel plot asymmetry. Let's see if we can... Here is our funnel plot here, and quite often people will look at these funnel plots and they'll ask the question, is there asymmetry in these funnel plots? And if there is asymmetry, a meta-analyst will often conclude, yes, there is publication bias because we see asymmetry in these funnel plots. But when you think about it, looking at a plot and making a decision based on you looking at a plot is quite subjective. But then what people do is there is actually an objective measure of funnel plot asymmetry, which is Eggers regression test, which we've run here using the reg test function from Metaphor. And we can see for this particular test, or the test for funnel plot asymmetry, the test was not statistically significant. So quite often what you'll see in meta-analyses is that the researcher will conclude, hey, there was no funnel plot asymmetry, therefore there was no publication bias. Now, there's two problems with this. The first problem is funnel plot asymmetry is not a measure of publication bias, despite it being written in many, many publications that I see in our review. it is not a measure of publication bias. What it is a measure of is small study bias, and that can include publication bias, but it includes a whole bunch of things which is often associated with small studies. So all you can conclude when you have an asymmetrical funnel plot is that there was some form of small study bias. And the second problem with this sort of thing is when you get a non-significant result, once again, it comes back to that original problem in that with a non-significant result, you cannot know whether this was due to data insensitivity or the fact that there was support for a null model. So a non-significant result from Egger's regression test really does not tell you that much. And that is why there are certain advantages to, or there are many advantages to doing a Bayesian meta-analysis. But before we get there, we are going to look at a frequentist approach for conducting a frequentist approach for specifically, or a test that's more specifically targeted at looking at publication bias. And this test is, they're called weight models or selection models. And essentially what's done here is for these, weight models is that the main assumption is that the likelihood of a study being published depends or is related to its p-value. So studies that have non-significant p-values are less likely to be published. Now, when you think about it, that's relatively a reasonable assumption, but it's important to remember when you're using selection models is that this is the key assumption, is that when you're looking at a selection model, is that the assumption is that you're running this analysis assuming that there is this relationship between the likelihood that a study is going to be published and its p-value. And depending on in some particular research fields, this is almost never going to happen, whereas in other research fields, it is actually more common that non-significant values are going to be published. So when you're doing these weight selection models, it's important to keep that in mind. So let's run our weight selection models, and this is using the weight R package. And what you do here is you simply, there's two things to run here. You include your measure of variance and, your measure of effect size, which is within our DAT file here. So it's DAT, and then we specify the particular variable, which is VI, and then the measure of variance as well. We will run this, and let's walk through the results here. So this estimates our meta-analysis again, so the model results. This is slightly different from our original result. And the reason this happened is for this particular package, they convert your effect size and variance into Cohen's d and run the analysis on that. So you're going to get slightly different results. Usually it's like a 2 decimal difference with it's very, very small, but that's why we don't get exactly the same results as our first analysis here. So this shows us, okay, so our conventional analysis, our estimate is 0.14 or 0.15 if you round up, which is exactly the same as what we got before. And then it does your test of heterogeneity like before. But then what it does is, for this particular analysis, assuming that there is a relationship between the likelihood of studies being published, what it does is it actually adds more weight to studies that were less likely to be published. So say that within your meta-analysis, you had one study and the p-value was 0.2, for instance. In a typical weight selection model, that study would be given more weight in your meta-analysis. Or if there was a study where there was a p-value of 0.4, for instance, any of those studies which in principle were less likely to be published, it increases the weight of that study and how it contributes to the overall summary effect size. Here we can see that once you adjust the weights of the study, that the estimate shrinks. Not a lot, but still appreciably. So we have our original estimate of 0.15, and then we have our new publication bias adjusted estimate of 0.09 here. And looking at the likelihood ratio test, now for this particular test, a number of researchers have suggested that for this test, the threshold for significance should actually be 0.1 instead of the conventional threshold of 0.05. And it's funny because this illustrates how arbitrary these thresholds are when it comes to our decision making when doing statistical inference. So if we were to take the recommended threshold for looking at publication bias, in this example, this would actually suggest that yes, for this particular meta-analysis, there is evidence of publication bias, because what this likelihood ratio test does is it compares two models. It compares our original model here with our publication bias adjusted model, or our weight adjusted model here. And with a threshold of 0.1, it is significant, but with the threshold of 0.05, it would be what's considered on the threshold of statistical significance. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to run our Bayesian meta-analysis. This is computationally intensive. So on my computer, which is maybe 5 years old, it takes about 5 minutes to run this analysis. I'm going to bore you by by running this analysis and doing nothing. So I've pre-run this analysis to save you that, and it is using the RoBMA R package. And here, for the main function, you specify the measure of the correlation measure, the number, and the study names if you want. And in order to replicate your analysis, you can also set a seed. So I've already pre-run that. It'll take some time depending on how fast your computer is, but for me, it takes about 5 to 10 minutes. So assuming we've run that before, let's have a look at the results here. So like I said before, when it comes to running this Bayesian meta-analysis, you are comparing two different models. And in this circumstance, we're comparing three things. Okay, so let's walk through this one by one. We are first looking at, we're comparing two models. One model, is there an effect? Or a model that there is an effect, and a model that there is no effect. The base factor here is 119. So looking at these results here, you can conclude there is 119 times more evidence for an effect than there is relative to a null effect. That's pretty convincing. I think that's very convincing. A second set of models are also produced looking at study heterogeneity. And essentially, once again, we are comparing two different types of models, a model that there is heterogeneity and the model there is no heterogeneity. And there's pretty good evidence here. So there's 25 times more evidence for heterogeneity, or for a model of heterogeneity versus a model of no heterogeneity. And for our third set, or third family of models, we have a publication bias. So here, there is only 1.19 times more evidence for publication bias versus a model that there is no publication bias. So this isn't entirely convincing. There's not that much there, 1.2 times more evidence. So this would suggest that you actually need more information. Typically, like I said before, one benefit of Bayesian or base factors is that you don't have to rely on thresholds. But at the same time, when you look at this, you wouldn't be too confident actually saying there is only 1.2 times more evidence for publication bias here. So this, I would say, wouldn't be very, very convincing. And what you can do here when looking at these model average estimates, you can actually see that this mean mu measure is the model average measure. So once you actually combine these different models, accounting for publication bias, a model that there's a whole combination of models, models that include heterogeneity or no heterogeneity, or effects or no effects, or publication bias and no publication bias. Once you average all those models together, we get this averaged estimate, which is 0.13. So you can consider this estimate going, this estimate actually accounts for the potential for publication bias. And when you compare it against our original estimate of 0.15, you can see that, yeah, it's shrunk a little bit, but not a lot. And that fits with our evidence for publication bias. We also have these Amiga estimates, and what they look at is the relative evidence based on these different thresholds. So we can see these estimates here. one other thing you can also do is look at the diagnostics for your particular test. So it's important to actually look at these things. And so for these for this particular analysis, it actually constructs 12 different models. And these 12 different models are ones that include a whole combination of publication bias, no publication bias, effect or no effect, and heterogeneity and no heterogeneity. And then within publication bias, there are two different types of models. One model which just uses a binary significant, not significant, and another model which is significant, borderline significant, or threshold significant, which is between 0.05 and 0.1, and non-significant, which is 0.1 or larger. It's important to look at these diagnostics when you're running these tests. So let's have a look down here. The R hat value, you want something which is less than 1.05. So these, or something that is close as possible to 1. All these models are very, very close to 1. So there's no problem here. And looking at this particular value, this estimated, this ESS model, ESS value, you want it as high as possible, above at least a couple of hundred. For this particular thing, there's no rule of thumb for what constitutes a high number, but you at least want something that's more than a couple of hundred. Okay, so that is how to perform a Bayesian meta-analysis. It is, if you know how to perform this in a frequentist approach, it is relatively straightforward to do this in a Bayesian approach. And the benefit is, one, you get this relative evidence for two different models. We can go back to our results here. And you can specifically look at this, whether there's an effect or not, whether there's heterogeneity, and whether there's publication bias as well. And you can account for publication bias using these estimates here. I want to finish with one thing, and that is saying that when you're using these selection models, what you're doing is these are estimates. So you are making assumptions which may or may not be true. So it's important to consider these tests as tests of sensitivity rather than actually this is the gospel result. So make that clear when you're reporting these things, that we are making estimates based on certain assumptions that certain studies are less likely to be published, which may or may not be true. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this. This was a quick little stream that I thought I would give a go. Please let me know any feedback. And this was based on a recent blog post that I published on my blog, dsquintana.blog, and you can see all the code there. I'm going to wrap up. Let us know what you think. See you later.